Hello everyone, Dr. Moreno here. Welcome to Module 3, where we are taking a look at various types of music literacy curricula. We're going to talk about what is music literacy, and then we're going to dig very surface levelly into a number of different kinds of literacy curricula, things such as rhythm, sight singing, expression, those kinds of things. And this will be just to give you an overview of the various readings. We'll talk about those at the very end, as well as some suggestions of other curricula that you might consider in your initial comparison contrast assignment that I will also talk about at the end of this video. There's the question. What do we mean when we talk about teaching music literacy? We talk about teaching how to read notes. We talk about how to understand rhythms. And oftentimes, that's where it stops. Raise your hand, even though we can't see each other, if there was a period of time in your own teaching career where that was your primary emphasis. It's not uncommon for that to be a primary emphasis. However, as with definitions of so many things in this world, our understanding of what music literacy really is has grown significantly over the years. So what does it mean to be musically literate? Well, I'm going to keep this slide very short and move on to some definitions and some suggestions, along with a goofy meme because they're funny. I showed this to my 8-year-old who is learning all the various concepts that you see. And her initial response was, I like to eat puppies. No, sweetheart, let's talk about the repeat sign. And then she was cackling away because, we need to understand how to read these things. It's not unlike there's a book from, oh my gosh, it's probably 2005, 2006 called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. And it's a whole diatribe on grammar, but specifically punctuation and how where you put punctuation in a definition determines what that definition really means. It's hilarious. Go check it out. It has nothing to do with this class, but it's just a little pro tip from me to you. Back to the subject at hand. In chapter 11 of the Conway text, we have this chapter. Heather Nelson Schuldis has taken a definition of literacy and applied it to a music setting. Music literacy, the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and compute musically using printed and written music notation materials associated with various musical contexts. Involves a continuum of learning, enabling individuals to achieve musical goals, to develop musical knowledge and potential, and participate fully in musical community and musical society. There's a lot to that, isn't there? The very first phrase, identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, compute, that is so much more than just pen and ink, isn't it? It's so much more than just note values and ledger lines. So what else is there though? Like in a music setting, what else could there be? I'm so glad you asked, except you didn't, but that's okay. Here is a not conclusive list of items that could be considered elements of music literacy. Obviously, we have notation, including both rhythmic values and pitches. Musical terms, right? Everything from what is a ledger line to what is adagio. Expressive qualities, talking about your dynamics or your tempo markings or articulations. Context and composer intent and historical information. Where did this piece of music come from? What was going on culturally, societally at the time? What was happening in the composer's life? What was the composer hoping to convey through that piece of music? Performance technique. There's a lot to be said for understanding how to use the instrument in the given moment, whether it be your voice or an external instrument. Can you really perform a piece the way it's intended to be performed if you don't fully understand the mechanisms of your instrument, the technique behind that? And there could be many, many other things. Insert yours here. Those could be some things to include in your hat journal this week. But there's so much more to it, right? And so understanding the idea of music literacy as an amalgam of skills and understandings versus just this one thing over here gives us so much room to explore and to help our students understand music from different levels. Understanding music literacy as this grouping as well can allow us to help different students connect in different ways. Everyone connects differently, right? No two individuals are exactly alike. And that could be because they have different backgrounds or they have different preferences or they have different learning skills or whatever. There's so many different ways that a student could engage with music differently than their peers. So one student might act like it might be the notation and the pitch and the rhythm and the musical terms, and that just digs them right in because they like structure and focus, and they operate very much on a logical, mathematical wavelength, right? Other students could not give two figs about that, but you give them the historical information and what's going on at the world at large at the time of that piece, they're hooked, right? This is also true for your audience. So, helping your students learn how to connect with the music so that they, in turn, can communicate the music to an audience who also then interprets in their own manner. This is all part of music literacy. You could say that we are building music literacy every time our students perform. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we're going to surface level dig into a number of different kinds of music literacy curricula. It is very likely that those of you in this course have already engaged even quite deeply with some of these methods. That will also be true for a good amount of the reading. None of this is likely to be like brand new to you. I shouldn't say none. Very little of this is likely to be brand new to many of you. So I would just encourage you to look for the new things. Look for something that perhaps you didn't think of before. Look for something that maybe is being explained in a different manner than you would normally explain it. Also consider something that maybe you don't incorporate on a regular basis, even though you're familiar with it and you see the value. Why don't you incorporate it? That kind of thinking could lead into your curriculum project and considering new things for your own teaching. So let's hop into this first one, music literacy, tonal audiation. If you've already taken Muse 610 Teaching and Learning, you have learned at least a little bit about Edwin Gordon and his music learning theory. And he coined this term, audiation, I'm reading directly from my notes, in 1975, to refer to comprehension and internal realization of music, or the sensation of an individual hearing or feeling sound when it is performed. So it's the idea of being able to hear something in your head without needing to hear it out loud. And there's good information in the Conway text. There's a lot of science about how we learn language through very similar things. We learn to associate oral speech with written communication and to make those connections to the point where we can hear letters and words and text in our minds. We can audiate it realistically without needing someone to speak it out first for us to echo it back. So in a musical sense, a lot of this, and they talk about this in the chapter, a lot of this can really be explored and can be learned even during the elementary years. There's so much tonal work and pitch matching work that can take place in elementary music classrooms. In fact, they often place a focus on those skills. But some students either don't have that experience in their elementary because maybe their music teacher focuses on other things. Maybe they're in a small district where they don't have a dedicated music teacher and they get whatever music in their classroom teacher is comfortable with. Sometimes perhaps a child is homeschooled and either their parent or the co-op they're part of hasn't been able to incorporate music into it. There's a whole host of reasons why a student might not have learned this earlier. You could also come across students who have had instrumental instruction. They've learned the piano or they've learned other instruments in their younger years, but they've not ever been given an opportunity to transfer those audiation skills through singing, which really is arguably one of the best ways to explore your audiation. So some specific skills that we're looking for in a tonal audiation curriculum. The ability to sing a resting tone or a static pitch, right? You want your students to be able to, first of all, you want them to be able to sing back to you one solid pitch and hold it. You also want them to be able to audiate that pitch, right? You want them to be able to sing in echo pitches with syllables and without syllables in whatever manner that you do that in. And it might be the solfege. It might be we'll look at a couple other recommendations or suggestions in a moment. It could be nonsense syllables. There's a lot of elementary systems that have come up with different kinds of, animals or fruits or things like that to help students make those representations or those connections. But you want them to be able ultimately to do that with syllables and without. Eventually, you have to let go of the syllables in favor of text, right? Relatedly, you want them to be able to recognize and perform a tonal pattern. So, yes, we need the resting tone. You can't do anything else if you can't hold that pitch, but you have to build on that. You can't stay there, right? So, you want your students to be able to recognize visually and orally, and then be able to perform those patterns. And then you just repeat, repeat, repeat in various manners. In the Conway textbook, all of the tonal audiation conversation comes out of chapter 8 by Christina Hornbach of Hope College. And so she gives a list of teaching strategies. These are straight out of the text, but they're so just solid. And so if you have done these, if you have followed somewhat of a pattern of this and it has worked for your students, continue doing that. Maybe something will come out here that you haven't considered before, and I would encourage you to do so now. These don't have to be, they don't have to be something that's you don't have to do these in this order. They're just suggestions. So number 1, discuss and model culturally inclusive and age-appropriate singing tone. When I first started my teaching career, I was under the impression that my high school students needed to sound older than they were because that was the best way for them to learn an appropriate tone. What that meant, though, and this is a whole vocal pedagogy thing for another time, but what that meant was they were trying to force their voices to create a tone that was not, dare I say, natural to their age, to their developmental level. And the more that I learned about the voice and the more that I learned about the voice at those ages, the more I began to discover a singing tone that fits the age or developmental level that you are currently in is arguably significantly healthier and more sustainable than trying to be something that you currently are not. So, age-appropriate singing tone, foundational to me. Next one, singing on a neutral syllable. So we mentioned this a moment ago. If you are teaching these individual pitches or even tonal patterns separate or apart from a piece of repertoire, you're teaching them in isolation. It goes back to the the Dr. Esther and Sound Connections methodology. If you are teaching in isolation, using a neutral syllable, so there's nothing to confuse things. You just need them to repeat the pitches. So you can use any neutral syllable that works for you in your setting at that moment. Text will come later. Explore new material as often as possible. You don't want your students to fall into a rut where they're no longer audiating because they've just memorized it, right? Similar to the idea that after you've sight read something, it's no longer sight reading, it becomes rehearsal. So changing it up, changing new things, even just like if you've got, you're using static sight singing exercises, just do different ones, right? Do things that are similar, but change one note or one rhythm value or whatever on occasion, just so that they're having to pay attention and remain engaged throughout the activities. These two, I think, kind of go together. Interactive teaching environment, playful and improvisatory environment. You could assume that these go with the elementary setting that is promoted throughout this chapter, but they don't have to, right? They really don't. I mean, interactive, let's be honest, we're in choir. We're interactive. It's already happening, right? But allowing students to take part in even devising the activity. And this is why I said they can kind of go together. If it's interactive in the sense that you're talking back and forth with your students and giving and receiving input, and then perhaps you're saying, all right, take these 6 pitches and create 4 measures in whatever order you want. Now they're creating something new, right? Give them a tongue twister and say, put it into pitch. There's something that's a little more on the playful side. All the while reinforcing audiation skills, pitch matching skills, resting tone skills. You're just reinforcing it all, but you're shifting the manner in which you're doing it. So it's something new, still keeping them engaged. This is where you start getting even more specifically into the individual learning. Encourage individual responses. So we talk a lot in the assessment realm about, in the choral assessment realm, about assessing the ensemble, but also assessing the individual. And how do we do that? You've got 50 kids in a classroom. You really have to make time to assess individually. but it's so worth it. And if you establish that communication style early, it can become less of a fearful thing for students who are perhaps a little shy or more reserved. There are some people who don't speak unless they feel the need to. And if you have other people who are shouting out the answers, you may never know whether or not the quiet student has really retained it. So, any opportunity for students to give their individual feedback, and this can be done in class, this can be done in a practice room, one-on-one, or in your office. This can be done through pre-recorded things that they submit. So many ways to do this that don't have to build a zillion extra hours into your teaching day. Practice and repeat. Have your students do these things regularly and often. The more opportunities they have to reinforce those skills, the stronger those skills can become. These last two also can work well hand in hand. More singing and less talking, sing a cappella whenever possible. I have quite a bit of experience with both of these. I have a tendency to over-explain. I love words, I love explanations, I love definitions. However, there comes a point when the students already know what's going on, and I could simply let that be for the day. It's been a challenge through my entire teaching career. It also means sometimes that classroom management gets a little muddy. If all that's ever happening is I'm talking and explaining things, what learning is really happening? So there was a day when I put a few instructions on the board. I did not say a word for the entire 75 minutes. And oh, it was challenging. Let me tell you, we got so much done that day. This also can come into play if you're having a stressed voice day, which obviously we don't want to have, but those things do happen, right? Similarly, yet not completely, sing a cappella whenever possible. Now, I am a pianist. In my teaching career, I can count maybe twice that I've ever had access to a regular pianist. Never on the regular for rehearsals, but for performances. So it was not uncommon for me to be accompanying my own choirs in our concerts. And so that gets old after a while. You want to be able to actually conduct your group. So we did a lot of a cappella. And actually, for the most part, my choirs usually had very good intonation. There's always one or two voices that stand out for various reasons, but on the whole, they'd stay in tune with each other. They'd stay in tune from beginning to end. It was really quite impressive, if I must say. But what that also does is it forces them to listen more. It forces their ear to stay on top of what's going on around them musically, intonation-wise, rhythmically, et cetera, to the point where eventually I can even simplify my conducting because they're listening so well. They've built up that habit of listening and singing in response to the listening that I don't have to be giving them every single moment of every single measure, which can be a challenge for those who are a little bit of a control freak like yours truly, but also can be very freeing and a very empowering experience for the students in their own performance. And last for this list, although not necessarily in an order of operations, establishing tonal context prior to starting a song. This is just like when you sit down and you play a 1-4-1-5-1 chord progression, right, to help establish their ear, or you give the scale or whatever. Helping their ears understand that tonal context or that tonal center is also, just like learning to sing a resting tone, is very foundational in helping students to build that skill. Now, if you're looking at mid 20th century or more contemporary pieces, that might not always work, or international pieces, right? That might not always work as well as it does for like Western European or early American tonal repertoire. But you could teach them different tonal centers. There's so many ways to do this, right? One of the additional articles for this week by William Winnick, Hybrid Methods in Sight Singing. This goes along very well with the idea of tonal audiation. When you go to a contest here in Indiana, it's ISMA. In Oregon, it was just like district or league. So many in North Dakota, I don't remember what it was, but you get what I'm talking about. When you go to these contests and they have a sight reading element, oftentimes the ensemble is given like 30 to 60 seconds to just look through the piece, right? Now, if it's rhythm only and no pitch, you're just looking for rhythmic challenges that, you need to pay attention to on the front end. But if it's pitched, if it's a melody, or melody and harmony, then you're hopefully doing audiation along the way. It's like I always am sitting there literally singing through the melody in my mind, as are many of the students. So when you're teaching students to sight sing or to sing on sight, you are incorporating that skill of audiation along the way, even if they've never touched it before. This is another formal way to encourage that kind of audiation. So here in Winnick's article, and you're going to go through and look at this more in depth, but he gives two different categories, basically, of sight singing. One category he calls more traditional methods, and the other he refers to as hybrid methods. With those traditional things like repeat after me, right? Although, is that really sight singing? Using numbers, having notes, assigned numbers, using fixed do. So C is always your do. That way there's like absolute consistency across the board, right? Intervallic, help teaching students intervals regardless of the pitch itself, but like this is the distance of a third, this is the distance of a fifth. Movable do plus pivot, basically movable do, but with an added opportunity to learn how to modulate in between and to pivot basically or adapt your solfege based on that modulation. That's a little more extreme, I would say, than a traditional method. But I'm not Winnick. So, I'll leave it to you to determine how you view that particular method. But then he goes on into what he calls hybrid methods. As you could see just by looking at the names of these methods, they're a little bit more involved, right? But they're just pulling in different ideas, different methodologies, basically, for how to teach different kinds of sight singing, utilizing minor more often than we might otherwise, using chromatic, incorporating that. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't already include chromatic in our sight singing instruction, but different ways to do it. So take a look at that article. I'll be interested to see the thoughts that you guys have on those different methods and whether or not you could see them working in your own setting or in a general high school choir setting. So those were some tonal audiation, sight singing, curricula suggestions. Now we move on to the idea of rhythm. This information comes out of Chapter 7 by Heather Russell from Cleveland State, and it gives a really good overview. So I'm only going to give you, some specific moments throughout the chapter, which really is what these are anyway, right? But she gives some ideas, these overarching principles when we're talking about teaching rhythm. I love the emphasis on the kinesthetic value, that we learn rhythm through movement and sound. It's something that we can physically feel, and therefore, why not learn it with physical incorporation? The emphasis of teaching it independently of other concepts. This is the sound before symbol or sound before sight. And we see that in the sound connections methodology and in Gordon's methodology as well. Embedded within context of repertoire, varied meters and styles is built by spiraling the curriculum, and individual instruction works even better in this kind of setting. Regular assessment. All of these things are key elements when we are talking about teaching rhythm. So let's talk about some specific things when implementing those different pedagogical tools. Determining what terms you're going to utilize and what the explanations and definitions for those are. Are you going to emphasize a steady beat? Are you going to talk about beat 1, beat 2, beat 3? Are you going to talk about a macro beat or a large beat? Are you going to talk about duple and triple? Are you going to talk about uneven? Whatever terminology you use, determine that in advance and be confident in that so that you are maintaining consistency in your instruction. Know how you're going to explain it, how you're going to define those things, so that when students have questions or when perhaps they're coming in and they've learned a different term or a slightly different definition, you can be clear and specific in helping your students understand how you instruct this moving forward. Consider also the sequencing of your instruction. There's a couple different ways that you can consider this. The text describes very well that these work best in tandem as opposed to individually, but we'll look at them individually just for clarity's sake. You can begin with beat competency, a system that emphasizes the beat, primary emphasis on the steady beat, and then moves on to macro, micro, large, small, strong, weak, etc. Beat competency systems utilize both gross and fine motor movement. So allowing students to perhaps walk in the beat, right? That gross motor movement, or perhaps, clapping the hands down on the lap, or even a clap, right? You could also move to that more fine movement, fine motor skill, where maybe it's a snap, maybe it's just a tap, right? Maybe it's just this little bit right here. A lot of different ways that we're using that movement because of the kinesthetic aspect of rhythm. I have found that most rhythm curricula, whether individual or embedded in other theory or sight singing kinds of things, begins from a beat competency standpoint, but not all, because we also. This table is found on page 166 of the Conway text and gives some great examples of the different kinds of ways that you can utilize movement in a beat competency setting. So they've listed, as you can see on the left side, a number of skills, looking at non-locomotor, which is movement that doesn't move you across the room, so clapping, snapping, tapping, whatever, versus locomotor, which does move you across the room, right? So moving with the flow and a steady beat pulse. One side alternating, one side left, one side right. These different kinds of things that students do with their bodies, doing it in a duple meter, doing it in a triple meter, unusual, or they also would label it uneven meters. This is also a great way to assess. You can absolutely use this as formal or informal assessment of individual student skill when it comes to beat competency. The other sequence would be teaching rhythm pattern skills. So an emphasis on patterns as opposed to individual beats. Now, these methods typically still will utilize an emphasis on the steady beats or the strong and weak beats, but they don't necessarily begin with just that. They might begin within a pattern and showing you where these things fit in. I taught private piano before I ever began teaching choir, and most of the method books that I utilized began with a beat competency. It's your classroom. It's your program. It is, or you and a teaching partner, but still, you as the educator get to determine what makes the most sense to me. What can I teach competently, consistently, and confidently? And then you go forth from there. Here's another table found on page 170 that also could work really well. I mean, it even says down at the bottom, a checklist could work really well as an assessment of individual skills. So chanting rhythm patterns on a neutral syllable or on rhythm syllables, listening and chanting it back, identifying similarities versus differences, doing that in duple, triple, unusual, etc. I don't particularly love the format of like underneath the content, how they've got that laid out. Do what you want. But again, a great way to just check in on how your students are doing. How well are they internalizing the information that you're working on? There's a good deal more information on these ideas in the Dalby article that you have in the library reading list, Toward an Effective Pedagogy for Teaching Rhythm, Gordon and Beyond. This talks about rhythm from the Edwin Gordon perspective, which Gordon was, you could say, an unofficial predecessor to Don Esther's work with Takadimi and Sound Connections. If you have not taken 610 Teaching and Learning, Gordon information may be fairly new to you. So this will hopefully be a little bit more of a complimentary and informative reading item for you this week. This next section harkens from chapter 10 out of the Conway text, and this is teaching musical expression and sensitivity. And there was a time when I would not have considered these items to be something that could have their own curriculum. They were items that I would teach through the course of the repertoire in preparation for, performances or contests or what have you. But the idea about being strategic and intentional about teaching your students these understandings and building these skills, I find very fascinating and really quite valuable. So let's just look at a couple elements that you might consider for yourself, perhaps for the first time, or at least, if not for the first time, maybe from a more intentional standpoint, the way that I found myself doing later in my career. Shaw gives a couple definitions first: musical expression versus sensitivity. Expression being the way in which musical sound conveys meaning to a listener. The expression is something that is active. You are doing something, right, to convey that meaning. Versus sensitivity, which is how someone receives that musical communication. This is passive. This is listening to it, experiencing it as a consumer versus the active creator or performer of the music. And they were very clear to break down these two concepts as different, related but different in this chapter. And so, put into one sentence, expression is the extent to which one conveys musical meaning, and sensitivity is the extent to which one receives musical meaning. Short and sweet. The author of this chapter, Ryan Shaw from Michigan State, goes on to give a variety of different teaching strategies for expression versus sensitivity. So again, expression being what you're teaching your students to convey the meaning, right? So teaching them to express intent and meaning and emotion. So the idea of oral modeling, singing something, asking them to listen to it so that they are getting that specific understanding of a sound based on your demonstration. I really like the description of this next one, deadpan versus expressive. So this is more of a compare contrast strategy where you are perhaps demonstrating two different versions of oral modeling for students, or having them sing it one way and then a different way so that they can differentiate between those two different things. You could do this for vowel shape. You could do this for tone quality. You can do this for other expressive elements, right? So we see this also throughout child development, human development, distinguishing between choices or actions or experiences by exploring both and then being able to build those distinguishing connections. There's a whole lot about this in 610 Teaching and Learning. Physical gesture naturally can be referring to your conducting gesture. It doesn't have to be. It can be things that you have students do when they're building up their expressive skill set, right? So, you might have students be swinging their arms back and forth so they can learn the pulse of a song, right? It might be doing different facial expressions that you are perhaps doing. There are all kinds of crazy things that we do in voice lessons to help students explore a different sound quality, like throwing a football or having antlers. If you're curious about those, let me know. I'll gladly explain them. But a lot of different physical gesture things that you can do as the director and or have them do as the singers. And then lastly, for expression, specific intentional verbal instruction on musical parameters. Listen for the beat, listen for the key change, listen for the vowel shape. You could emphasize verbal instruction on imagery and metaphor. What is a scene from a movie that this makes you think of? Think of an experience you had where you experienced this emotion. What kind of color does this make you think of, right? This has worked really well for me with some individual students. If you've ever read any of the work by Oliver Sacks and learned anything about synesthesia and how people often can translate the world or interpret the world through numbers, through letters, through colors, that this will make a little bit more sense. I had a high school student who was also taking private lessons with me. She was in the choir that I taught, and then she was taking lessons. And I was trying to, this is early in my teaching career, I was trying to help her discover a particular tonal quality in her voice. And her voice and my voice were very different in their qualities in general. So my demonstrating, my modeling simply wasn't working between the difference in our natural tone and just how she was interpreting that. And so then at one point I said, why don't you sing this like grass green? And all of a sudden, the exact sound that I had been looking for, she produced immediately. Did she have synesthesia? I don't know. I don't know that she was ever tested, but she connected with the idea of considering color. And that was a breakthrough moment for me in how I could work with individual students to explore different things with their voices based on not necessarily my model or a specific musical parameter description. We can also give verbal instruction related to specific emotions or moods. You know, singing something more sadly, singing something with excitement, singing something with anticipation, etc. Utilizing multiple of these strategies helps to reach more students and sometimes helps to reach even one student in multiple ways. You never know how the instruction you provide is going to help a particular student connect to music. Funny how we keep coming back to that idea. Shaw goes on to explore a couple different teaching strategies for sensitivity because your performers, your students, are performers, but they're also listeners. They also have opportunity to experience music, right? And oftentimes, that experience of listening is what draws them to the music, not necessarily, to private lessons, but like to being part of it. And it could be, I should just go back and start this all over. However, I'm halfway through this slide, so we're going to stick with it. Learning to listen with sensitivity is a skill, and we want to encourage that in our students. So you can encourage what's called convergent listening, the idea of focusing on a fixed subject. This is typically more objective. Listening for beat, listening for tempo, listening for, you could put tone quality in there. I'm not going to because I have it later in a moment. It makes more sense to me in the other category. You could talk about vowels, you could talk about diction, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're listening for those convergent, those focused, those objective things, right? Versus encouraging divergent listening, where you're focusing on something that is perhaps more variable. Tone, color, or tone quality, expressive qualities. Dynamics could be convergent, like it's loud or it's not, but it could also be, what are the dynamics doing? How would you describe that? Right? So divergent listening can result in a more subjective response. And teaching your students to listen in both of these ways, teaching them to build sensitivity that is related to both these areas, helps them have a fuller understanding of what they're listening to, which can further strengthen their ability to express, right? And you have this beautiful cycle of expressing and receiving and communicating and receiving and communicating and receiving. Now, again, I would not have ever thought of expression and sensitivity as being a specific curricula. But you know what else I haven't thought of as being a specific curricula? Social emotional learning, or SEL. And yet there are entire curricula built specifically for incorporating that. And I discovered this over the last few years when SEL was becoming more prominent in this world. And after Scott Edgar was writing more of his articles and texts, and is specifically applying it to the music education setting. And actually, a few of my undergrads built a curriculum project around incorporating SEL into their choir curriculum. So there are so many different things that you could build a curriculum around that might not be a standard, typical, formulaic kind of thing. I would argue expression and sensitivity is one of those things. And yet here you have opportunities to explore that. So this last piece, I just want to introduce you really quickly to some of the other readings and learning activities for this module. We already looked at one of the articles. This is straight out of the reading list. There's 4 articles that dig more deeply into, again, the Gordon regarding rhythm, those hybrid methods in sight singing, and then two other articles, one on theory, music theory instruction. Music theory is one of those things that as a curriculum, as a methodology, I used to find challenging to incorporate. I began playing piano when I was 5 years old. I understood a large amount of music theory before I even got to college. Obviously not ensemble theory, but we got there. And so the idea that my choir students didn't have that same knowledge and that I needed to provide it to them felt fairly daunting at the time, but it doesn't have to be. And you may already incorporate a good amount of theory training in your classes. If you're doing rhythm training and you're doing tonal audiation and you're doing pitch matching, you're teaching theory. You are. So that's fantastic because you're helping build up those skills for them to be able to dig into music in a more focused and sustainable way. But there are other things that we can do also, right? So aside from this, there are also a few other sources that I would like you to take a look through as you're just exploring these different kinds of literacy curricula. One of which you are very likely familiar with, sightreadingfactory.com. This is a fantastic resource where you can go in and but it will provide Sometimes, depending on the level of subscription you have, randomly selected exercises on a given day. You can filter it down by uh, pitches, you can filter it down by rhythms, you can filter it down by voice parts, you can filter it down by time signatures and key signatures. So many different ways you can do. You can use it for free. You can also have paid subscriptions that give you even more control over how much you want to filter down the things that are going to be in front of your students on a daily basis. So if you're not already familiar with it, go take a good look through there and just see what they offer and see if that might be something that either you are interested in for the compare contrast assignment that I'll get to in a minute, or if it's something that you would like to perhaps consider for research on your final project. Another source, musictheory.net. You may also be familiar with this. Individual assignments that can be, you can use for assessment. Students can do these at home. They can do them on a computer. They can do them on a tablet or other device. These, again, can be great tools. I believe that there are paid versions. Don't quote me on that. I believe there are paid versions in case you wanted to go more in depth also. Check that one out. This was the one that really got me going, though, early on. If you're not familiar with Masterworks Press, they've been around for, I would say, at least 20 years. Well, about 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. But they used to send printed, mailed copies of their catalogs with like sample pages. And I saw that, and that became a game changer for me because, as you can see right there on the screen, your source for reproducible sight singing methods. So what's great about this is as soon as you purchase the license, you can make as many copies as you need to if you're doing printed copies because you own that license. And so you can see right above the top, they have so many different categories of sight singing: mixed choir, treble choir, men's choir, rhythm studies, rounds, general music, and then my personal favorite, music theory for choirs. This was a game changer for me because it enabled me to incorporate music theory into my choir classroom without having to build something from scratch. This was before musictheory.net. And without having to wonder, like, how are they going to do this without a piano? Because again, I learned all of my music theory from a piano standpoint, for many years at the beginning. So is this the best method for choral theory instruction out there? I don't know. It was great for me. It includes lessons with worksheets, quizzes, tests, finals. It goes all the way into like the different key signatures and advanced time signatures and minor and harmonic minor, all the stuff. Didn't get into modes, which is fine because that's a little bit more than I was concerned with during the years that I was teaching that. So that is a quick walk through the items, the learning items for this week, separate from the textbook. I realize that there's a good amount of information here to be working through over the course of this module, but a lot of it, again, will likely be familiar to you in different, capacities. A lot of it builds on itself, I think, quite well, and it's just a great introduction to other resources that are out there because you have an assignment that is forthcoming. And that is the initial comparison contrast assignment. There will be a secondary related assignment to this later. That's why it's called initial. But you're going to do exactly what it says here. You're going to choose 2 curricula that focus on the same content theme. Maybe it's 2 theory curricula. Maybe it's 2 sight singing curricula. Maybe it is 2 movement curricula. Obviously, there are some different curriculum content themes that we haven't gotten to yet. We're going to be getting into them, but you can absolutely still choose one of those subjects. Entirely up to you. You could look into things like expression. You could look into things like SEL. Your choice. Student's choice. And you're going to compare and contrast these 2 items. You're going to provide a document that gives a description of each curriculum. Where did it come from? What are the main goals? What's the progression of instruction? Like they start here and they do this and then they do this and then they end with this. You're going to give just a few examples of the activities and the assessments. Those examples, if you have like an image of an item, it could be that, but make sure that you're providing an understanding of what these things are. Any notable similarities between the 2 and notable differences. right? So, I mean, a notable similarity, obviously, well, they're both sightseeing and curricula. Okay, what else is similar about them? This is very important. If you look about 2/3 of the way down the slide, this paper will not include your personal views. This is not the place to talk about what you like about it or what you don't like about it or what you prefer. That will come later. This is to present the information in a factual, unbiased manner. You are simply saying, here's what it is, right? This is not a large paper. Minimum of 3 pages, no more than 5. If you go a little over 5, that's fine. I would rather you feel like you've done your full work than otherwise. That is the assignment. So if you have questions about that, don't hesitate to holler. This assignment is open. It is available to you in Canvas. You can go ahead and get started on that at any time. This is due at the end of Module 4. So if you are viewing this video at the start of Module 3 or of Week 3, you have 2 weeks, basically, to complete this. I look forward to seeing what you come up with along the way and considering all the different curricula that are out there that even I'm not familiar with yet. So dig into different kinds of curricula, different content themes, different styles. Start taking a look at those things. I will see you in the next video.